Okay, folks, it's 9:30. Let me ask Dave Strohmeyer from Montana, our moderator, come on up, and just Adrian and Karen. We'll get going. I'm really excited about this morning. I thought we had a great breakfast session. Karen, as usual, your commentary is superb. We are going to be talking about a concept called high performance rail, which basically begins to take a look at the railroads as a very important economic asset. And that's what we're going to focus on today in terms of agricultural exports and the general economy and supply chain, national security, energy security. So we've divided the session, our first session with high performance rail. The railroads are the backbone of our Northwest economy. We have senior executives from BNSF and Union Pacific and Peter Friedman from the Agricultural Transportation Coalition that will make the presentation. And it's really important in high performance rail to take a look at joint investments, public and private investments in terms of capital or operating passenger trains from the railroad perspective, first and foremost. What is good for their customers and their future customers in terms of capacity and access. So from that perspective, we're very pleased with this first panel. And then the second panel, Better Together, we're going to drill down a little bit on some governance models. Rob Padgett is here from the Capital Corridor to talk about a unique governance model that involves an independent authority dealing with the railroad, having a direct service agreement with the railroad, but also accommodating passenger trains. So I'm going to turn over to Dave Strohmeyer. Dave is a good friend, Missoula County Commissioner, Montana, the visionary for this larger network of Greater Northwest Passenger Rail, and also the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, which is really with us in the city of Boise, really handling the whole really important session tomorrow. Dave and Big Sky are actually a partner with PNW and the accelerator, and along with the Valley Regional Transit folks from the Boise area, in advancing this high performance rail agenda. So I'm pleased that he's able to come a little early down from Montana and join us today, as well as run the show tomorrow. Dave?
Is this live?
Okay. The perennial technical difficulties. Welcome, everyone. Great to have you, especially when there's such scintillating other options like feral swine. I'm barely here myself thinking about that. So great to have you with us this morning as we kick off the Greater Northwest Passenger Rail Summit here in Boise, Idaho, and also as we continue in our collaboration with and participation in PNW's annual conference. So this morning, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from some great participants in this panel. We'll have an opportunity to have some discussion amongst ourselves and also with you. So I live in Missoula, Montana. I live about 200 yards from the BNSF/Montana Rail Link main line. This was formerly the Northern Pacific Railway main line, and it was completed in 1883. Railroads in the western United States and western North America have a long and complicated history. As this rail line 200 yards from my home came through, arguably it was a major factor in the dislocation of indigenous peoples throughout my region of the country and the American West. Somewhat ironically today, many of the tribal communities that I deal with in my work as part of the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority are embracing rail as an option to provide connectivity and social and economic opportunities for their people. As I look to this rail line 200 yards north of my home, some of what I see rolling past are, and we've heard this earlier, fuselages from aircraft, blades for wind turbine projects and wind turbines, petroleum products, coal, all manner of commodities that we've been talking about over the past few days here in Boise. So it's only fitting that we look at rail specifically as this backbone piece of infrastructure in the greater Pacific Northwest region of this continent. So our guests today are Karen Hedlund, Vice Chair of the Surface Transportation Board, Adrian Guerrero, Assistant Vice President of Public Affairs for Union Pacific, Angela Cadell, BNSF Railways Group Vice President for Agricultural Products, and Peter Friedman, Executive Director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. Peter and Angela are joining us virtually and online, and I see you out there. Welcome, Angela and Peter. We're going to kick things off with each of our esteemed panelists providing just a few minutes of overview from their perspective on this topic. I will endeavor to prime the pump a little bit with some probing questions for us to get started with, and like I say, there will be an opportunity for all of you joining us either online or in the room to use your Whova app to pose questions to the group. So without further ado, we're going to begin with Karen Hedlund. And let me get the clicker.
Okay.
You just have one
This is
slide,
working.
perhaps.
Yeah, okay, I do have a live mic. Well, you heard a little bit about my background in the last session, so I won't go over that again. But I'll tell you what has been most interesting for me as a new member of the Surface Transportation Board. My background, as you well know, is primarily in passenger rail. I worked on the California High-Speed Rail project. When I was at WSP, I worked on the proposed high-speed rail project from Portland to Seattle to Vancouver. Spent a lot of time when I was at FRA putting money out to projects that were on the Class 1s, but for the benefit of passenger rail. So I wind up at the STB and discover that I don't know why they put me there, because I really don't know that much about freight. But I do today. Actually, I learned a lot about the freight railroads when I was negotiating with them, what were called service outcomes agreements, where we were putting money into freight railroads for the benefit of passenger rail. And I, learned to read string lines and learned about conflicts and learned about RTC studies and all the rest. But a year and a half later, I have to tell you, I now know more about agriculture than I have ever known in my entire life. And the importance of our railroads, particularly our Western railroads, to the agriculture industry in the West. It could not survive without them. And I'm learning a lot about the impact of what's going on in Ukraine on agriculture in the United States, and the importance of our railroads in getting, the big question is always about this time of year. Are you ready for the harvest?
Yes.
Angela? Angela, you ready for the harvest? Yes. So that's what we're going to talk about a lot this morning. And I'm interested in hearing what these folks have to say.
Thank you, Karen. And next, Adrian.
Check, there we go. Thank you, David. And thanks to Pinware for the invitation to join the conference panel. I loved seeing the title, right? Railroads are the backbone of the economy, of the U.S. economy. On the feral swine piece, by the way, when I heard that, I was like, that's either a pejorative term about the freight railroads, or we're talking about federal pork funding, right, for projects, which gets me excited, but sounds like I'd rather be on that panel. But no, I'm going to share some good news stories and kind of what's gotten us here, and it's obviously been quite the journey over the last couple of years, particularly over the last year. and getting UP and the railroad industry to where we need to be for our customers, for our communities, and for our employees and shareholders. When I think about that title, though, railroads are the backbone, I go back to pre-COVID, and the railroad and the railroads are good at a lot of things. I think what we fail at a good amount of the time is telling our story and explaining what's going on, why we do things the way we do, and where we're going. Where do we see the future of not just the industry, but also the economy? And again, railroads were essentially forgotten, in my opinion, up until COVID. And COVID led to part of the big challenge was supply chain crisis. And all of a sudden, the supply chain was, hot fudge sundae was this big, sexy topic that nobody really paid attention to until, of course, consumers started saying, where's my PPE? Where's our stuff? Oh, it's over at the West Coast ports. Oh, it's stuck in a rail yard. It's stuck at a warehouse. And I think that really opened the eyes of what was happening within the overall industry. And I think we've done a better job of utilizing, never letting a good crisis go to waste. We had to explain to the American public and of course to regulators and elected officials what was going on and what we were doing about it. So I think there's just been a lot more knowledge since then. And, we're not immune to the external economic factors that, plagued a lot of other sectors within the transportation industry. I think we were pretty much the last ones to be affected. And we saw that really manifest over the last year and a half. And what I mean by that is effectively, our labor shortage, our workforce, arguments out there that a part of it was self-inflicted, other arguments that COVID really accelerated that. And up until, I'd say, the Omicron variant, we were maintaining 75, 85% attainment amongst our employees, which was really strong amongst the entire transportation industry. And so as we look to that, we are now in a place where we have been on a hiring spree, as you may be seeing in your local communities. And we feel prepared. You asked about harvest. We have our locomotives in place, we have equipment in place, we have employees in place within our terminals that are prepared for that, coming out of a nasty winter and looking to a successful harvest season, hopefully a successful peak intermodal season as well. So as I mentioned, harvest and intermodal, just a little bit about Union Pacific. So we operate over 32,000 miles of track in 23 states west of the Mississippi. This is a good mix of our UP business, effectively sectored into thirds. And as we think about agriculture, we're looking at the bulk, right? 33% of our business there, our business mix. And again, I mentioned roughly about a third. It used to be, we had 4 different commodity sector groups. We've consolidated those into 3, and I think these 3 commodity groups really lend themselves well to the operations of that equipment, of those cars, and the way that we build those trains to serve those customers. I talked about what we've been coming out of over the last year and a half. And this slide shows a couple different things. So we really talk about the network resiliency and building that and planning for it better, investing in it more. There's a lot of metrics in our freight scorecard, right? What our health is of the railroad on any given day, any given week. And of course, all of this is reported at the federal level so that we can explain to our regulator community on here's what we witness right now within the industry at UP, and here's what we see going forward. One of those metrics is freight car velocity. And that shows not just the velocity of the trains themselves, right? The mile per hour, the average mile per hour that we're operating the railroad, but it also talks about how many miles within a day we're transporting a train. So the higher the MPH and the higher the daily miles traveled, those are both good things. And you see the comparison between last year and where we are as of May this year. So we're up to 209 miles traveled days, so that's good health metric. The other is operating inventory. And I don't want to confuse that with car loadings. The two in a healthy environment should be the same, right? So if we're seeing about 160,000 car loads a week, that operating inventory should be around that same number. But if it's over, that means we have more cars in the system, and that shows that we're starting to get congested. And so when I look at last year, the 183,000 number, and now we're down to 171, it tells you that we've been able to effectively move 10,000 additional customer cars outside of our system in a given week, which is very good news for us. I talked about the weather. UP, BNSF, all the railroads deal with weather. We like to think ours is special sometimes in certain territories. But we work through it as quick as we can, as effectively as we can in making the right investments. And some of those images show what we've been experiencing through our Transcon route over in the Donner Pass area, which has been significantly impacted. We have about, I think, 83 feet total of snowpack this year, which was significant, which did not impact our rail line this year, which is very good news. And I would argue, most importantly, on the employee front. So UP has about 33,000, a little over 33,000 employees right now to date. And over the last year, we had an effective target of filling in at 1,400 positions. We've done that, knowing that there would be about a 600 employee attrition in that time, in that span. And so we've increased our employment in TE&Y, train engine yard positions, by 5% in that time frame. And we have seen that primarily in our northern region. So looking at Northern California all the way to Chicago. We have to figure out how to better work with our local communities and talent pipelines to continue keeping that employee base to where we need, so we don't end up in a position like we were last year, where effectively we thought we were right-sized at one point. Demand goes up, supply goes up. You mentioned Ukraine, a lot more agricultural business booming in the PNW, and we saw that in the export market. We saw that at the ports. And so we need to continue maintaining a sustainable level in order to accommodate the service needs of our customers. Last but not least, I mentioned investments. When we're going over our investments over the course of a year, you see that pie chart. We're looking, it takes a lot, obviously, to run a physical plant in our infrastructure replacement. That's going to be the lion's share of our investment, which is $3.6 billion in 2023. Technology, our locomotive assets, and capacity in commercial facilities make up the remainder of how we split that difference. And you see over 85% of a capacity investment directly impacts mainline operations. That's going to touch new sidings, siding extensions, terminal location investment projects, as well as our signal system, where we're still transferring from an ABS system to CTC. And as a matter of fact, we've done a lot of those investments with our passenger partners as they've seen the mutual benefits of making those investments as well. And the key corridors, I'm happy to show this, the PNW and the Golden State, as it relates to what we see for the western half of our network and the West Coast ports. But that PNW, there's a lot of investment that we're looking at, and those are going to be with existing siding projects and new siding projects throughout the corridor to continue maintaining those service levels. So there's a lot, I can go into a lot more detail on all these, but I want to pause and make sure we have enough time for the remainder of our panelists, but a lot of good things on the horizon.
All right, thank you so much. And we will now go to Angela, who's joining us online. Angela, we have your slide deck queued up. Just let me know when you want the slides advanced.
Great, thank you, Dave. Sound check, everything good? Everybody can hear me? Excellent. Well, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. Even though it's virtual, so some hate to miss it live and in person, but we were able to make this work. So thank you very much for the staff for enabling me to join virtually. But wanted to share with you all some information on BNSF and specifically how we serve our ag customers. So the next slide really highlights our network, and just starting with who we are at BNSF, we're owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And our network runs, as you can see from the map, primarily west of the Mississippi to the West Coast, both north, south, and in between. So this is where we serve markets and commodities and customers that support really all parts and sectors of the U.S. economy. The next slide really emphasizes, puts a microscope on our ag business and specifically in the PNW. So I lead our ag group. We handle not only grain, corn, soybeans, wheat, which we generally talk about when we think about ag, but also the inputs, the fertilizer for our farmers, and anything processed from grain, flour, feed ingredients, clean fuels, ethanol, renewable diesel, all extremely important to our economy, food, fuel, energy. And of course, we work with all the stakeholders, our customers, including the U.S. farmers, grain elevators, feed yards, and processing facilities. So on the left hand of your screen here, you can see a map of how we've innovated what we call the shuttle network over the last 2 decades. And we have frankly built up the best in class grain supply chain in the world. And so each dot on that map represents investments on BNSF that can handle 110 car unit trains of grain. So some of those dots load grain in the producing areas, some unload these trains to meet demand, but all are extremely efficient in how they load and unload these trains. And it allows the market to pivot based on demand changes. And you can also see a map of the Pacific Northwest where I've highlighted the major grain exporters on the West Coast. And so together, our customer investment, BNSF investment, we've been able to build out this low cost, efficient supply chain of getting grain from the interior quickly to fill the vessels headed to the foreign buyers of US grain. And that has enabled US exports to increase over time. So if you look at the bars here, you look at the PNW stats, right? 20 years ago, the PNW represented only about 15 to 16% of all US grain exports. Today, it's 30% of all US grain exports. And that doesn't happen by accident, right? This network is crucial in meeting demand for US grain. It takes collaboration with customers, innovating side by side with the marketplace, and of course, investment. So the next slide shows a little bit about our investment here that I want to highlight. And again, the investment BNSF makes back into our network, it's to serve all of our customers. And BNSF alone has invested over $38 billion in the last 10 years. That's to ensure a safe and reliable railroad to provide service that our customers require, and also to continue to grow and meet the needs of all of our customers. So you take a year like this year, there's a lot of economic uncertainty, yet we continue to invest. This year alone, we have a capital plan of $3.96 billion. And so this map calls out a few of those expansion projects this year. One I want to highlight and just spend a second on is that we have completed the second mainline bridge span across Lake Pend Oreille here in Sandpoint, Idaho. And so that is a huge add to capacity that allows us 2 main lines across that geography for both freight and Amtrak and across one of our primary grain corridors. So thank you to all of you in the room that have supported us on that project. This has been a multi-year effort, and happy to report that both tracks will be open this summer ahead of the fall harvest. So that's increased capacity on that major grain corridor. So just to close, I do want to highlight that BNSF, we've certainly had some challenges. Adrian mentioned them just from an industry perspective, but we do take tremendous pride in delivering transportation services to our freight and passenger customers across the country. We recognize the vital role that rail plays in the nation's economy, in supply chains, to the US farmer, and to passenger travel. And that's a role we don't take lightly. And we have in the past continue to and always have had that commitment to growth. And that's reflected in our investment history. And you can just see that ongoing investment in this slide today. So again, thank you for the time, and look forward to questions that you have during our panel here.
Thank you so much, Angela. And speaking of questions, again, a reminder, if you are in the room or joining online, please use your Whova app to submit questions. Our next guest, Peter Friedman.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to ask for that slide in a second. Maybe we don't need it right yet. But I want to say hi to Laura and Stephanie and others. But let me start out by this. It is a great opportunity to do this session with the railroads. We've been spending a fair amount of time getting our nomenclature in sync with the railroads as to what agriculture is. So the railroads call agriculture generally the bulk loading materials that Angela mentioned. They're the big volume products, the grains and so by bulk. I'm talking about hay, that's the forage, soybeans, dairy, potatoes, French fries, beef, pork, poultry, lumber, paper, hazelnuts, onions, all things that are grown, processed, and exported from the Pacific Northwest, US and Canada, and in significant volumes and all moving by container. And I think the railroads traditionally call that the intermodal when it goes by container, but those are the products I'm talking about. And I think those are a lot of the agriculture products that folks in the room there are familiar with, that are kind of the products that folks, apples, I forgot to mention apples, and other fresh fruit. People are pretty proud of those products produced in the Pacific Northwest. So let me go back to that slide. If I could have that slide again. It's a very important point. There's nothing we produce in agriculture or forest products in the United States that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world. Nothing. Some people in Congress and elsewhere, you think that, you know, if the world wants to eat, they have to buy it from the US. Unfortunately, I guess it's not true. And we have found if we can't deliver affordably, dependably, then those foreign customers, particularly in the Asia Pacific, which is the biggest customer block for US agriculture, they will find some other place in the world to source those products that they want to eat, that their cattle need to eat, and so forth. So that's what's at stake. It's not, well, that's what's at stake. We're very much in jeopardy if the transportation system doesn't work. So we can take the slide down, but you've had a chance to see some of the agriculture products that we're talking about, and I'll be speaking about, that are sourced in the Pacific Northwest and throughout the United States, but transit through the Pacific Northwest on UP and BN to get to the gateway ports, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland. So here's our challenge. Delivery to the Asia Pacific doesn't start at the seaports. It starts inland places. And our entire global supply chain, in terms of the US anyway, in agriculture, moves from the east, it moves from the west to the east, from Asia to the United States. It's all those clothes and things we buy, all the consumer goods, they're all pouring into the United States, generally twice the volume, sometimes 3 times the volume, and during the supply chain crisis, about 6 times the volume of imports coming into the United States in container, as opposed to the export volume going out in container. And where do those imports go? They go to where people live, where the consumers are. And those consumers are Chicago, Dallas, and east. 2/3 of the American population lives east of the Mississippi River plus Texas. So that's where all those import containers go, with some exception for Los Angeles, Long Beach area. The problem is, as we all know, agriculture doesn't come from those places. The stockyards are no longer in downtown Chicago. If they were, the entire rail supply chain would be much easier, wouldn't it? But that's where the containers are going with the consumer goods. But somehow we've got to get those containers to places such as Minot, North Dakota, Pocatello, Idaho, the Tri-Cities area in Washington, the Utah, rural Utah areas, the Willamette Valley, the places where there are fewer people, fewer consumers. And so railroads play a critical role in repositioning those containers, once they're emptied of the consumer goods, to places where we need them to load them with Idaho potatoes, with Oregon, Washington, Idaho hay, with other products coming from the rural areas. So we need those containers in those locations, and how do we get them there? And this is kind of a final point. First of all, I've mentioned places that are long distances away. So you've got to get a container from Chicago to Eastern Washington or to Idaho before it can be loaded up with some French fries if it's a reefer, or other products, onions and so forth from Utah, and then going to the port. How do you do it? You can't do it by truck. It's too far. We have all sorts of hours of service regulations that limit the number of hours a trucker can drive, and hauling a truck, an empty container on the back of a truck, 1,000 miles is not very profitable. People don't do it. We depend on the railroads to do that repositioning of containers, not only to bring the containers laden with all our consumer goods coming into LA, Long Beach, Seattle, Tacoma, Oakland, and bringing them all the way east, but bringing the empty ones back, or getting them to locations such as I just mentioned, which are now emerging as inland rail loading points, which have not previously existed, where the railroads, as Angela can go into far more detail, but the railroad wants that longer route, and getting the railroad to stop for a load in some of these intermediate locations that I just mentioned is an economic challenge for the railroads. So it's something we've been working on together with the port authorities, and it's very important to get done. So therefore, the railroads are critical to stopping in those rural areas, particularly in the region of the Pinwar states, where the distances are great, and to get them loaded and then haul them to the gateway ports. So that's a little bit on the supply chain. We were very pleased. We just finished our annual meeting that was in Tacoma. 571 agriculture exporters and service providers, senior leadership of the Union Pacific came, and we focused exclusively on this container movement of all the agricultural products, the smaller specialty grains, value-added processed goods, and so forth. And that's where our partnership with the railroads is so important, because they've got to move those containers so we can get our agriculture out and to the foreign markets. So that's what I'm about. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Peter. And while it's still fresh in our memory and your mission statement is burned into our brains from looking at this for a while here, a question for you, Peter. So without necessarily throwing on anyone under the train, concrete examples are always great. So do you have an example of a foreign customer that actually ended up going to another source because delivery was perceived as inefficient, unaffordable, or lacking dependability?
Yeah, and we have several. If you'd come to our meeting and we'd ask the 571 people there, you'd probably have 571 examples that people could offer over the years. Now, we have, unfortunately, a laboratory for finding out is every time the West Coast ports close down, shut down, slow down because of the labor negotiations that happen, which are happening currently in Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Unfortunately, the US supplier of a product gets the opportunity to learn what happens when they cannot be an affordable, dependable supplier. And that's unfortunate. It has happened too frequently, every 5-6 years, and it's happening to some of the Canadian agriculture right now, today even. So an example, in 2008, 7 and 8, West Coast ports slowed down. The Japanese Ministry of Agriculture wrote to our US Department of Agriculture and said, your ports may not be working, but our cows continue to eat. What did Japan do? In a very organized fashion, the government of Japan, together with its industry, invested. First of all, they turned and had to buy on an emergency basis, God knows how much money from New Zealand and Australia and Argentina, what little bits they could position, but they didn't wait around for that to happen again. They've invested millions of dollars in developing sourcing in Argentina. And Japan has now found a major source, not exclusively and certainly not replacing all that the US sells, but at least something. The other example would be the almond exporter, who about that same time couldn't get their almonds to a Japanese confectioner. That Japanese confectioner was coating those almonds into these candy bars. They couldn't get the almonds. The best almonds in the world and hazelnuts, they come from California and Oregon. But you know what? They just turned to Turkey and got their inferior almonds and kept slathering them with chocolate. And apparently that was good enough, because in these years since, 12 years since, this California almond exporter has not been able to recover that Japanese customer. Once you change a supply chain, imagine that, investing in developing a supply chain in Turkey, coming from Argentina to replace the US supply, you're not going to come back. Very expensive to change your supply chain and then to change it back. So those are two examples.
Thanks, Peter. That's great.
Not so great.
You mentioned earlier story, telling your story. And maybe this is for both Angela and Adrian. So by way of an example, personal example that I experienced recently in engaging someone who I will not name, a congressional staffer, and I was making the case for public investment in private infrastructure, private rail infrastructure. And this individual, and it's always hard to tell in these cases whether this individual is actually reflecting the viewpoints of his or her boss, but there was this kind of perplexed response. Why should we be putting public dollars into private rail infrastructure? And what that, I guess, hit on for me is that clearly BNSF, UP are investing heavily in their infrastructure, but there is also an appropriate role for public investments also. So I guess just to kick things off, what do you think telling your story more effectively, cogently to the public, to partners might look like? And specifically, do you have any thoughts on this quandary for some? Why is it that we should be investing in this at all, even though we don't think twice if we're investing in public roadways and highways?
No, that's a great question, David. I think, we face this question a lot, especially in areas like Chicago, right, where we developed the CREATE program, Karen and I's hometown. We've seen this a lot in Oregon, right, with the advent of Connect Oregon program. We've seen it in California with a host of projects on the passenger side, I would call it, more so on the high-speed rail side, and their engagement with Union Pacific. And there are inherent natural public benefits with freight rail. As businesses, we're going to make our investments to run a safe and effective operation, right? One that serves the customers. There's those benefits. But then when you think about the situation like CREATE, which all happened because of a massive snowstorm in '99, and how did we shut down the rail system, which thereby impacted local roads, schools, hospitals, arterial routes throughout Chicago? And how did you look at grade separations and grade crossing improvements that have those benefits? So I think when we're thinking again about there's a crisis situation that impacts far beyond what is just railroads. You see a project or a proposal that is beyond just a freight benefit. And we really see this more manifesting now in economic development, And I had heard, I think it was Peter who mentioned, you know, the concept of inland ports and transload facilities. And we see states wanting to help develop that. One, from a manufacturing standpoint for the strength of the local economy, from a workforce development standpoint, from a sales, income tax, property tax, revenue standpoint, they want to help develop it, and they see the benefits of having rail. So by no means do the freight railroads expect for those agencies to fully fund projects. I think the expectation is, hey, if you help us model, if we model this together, whether it's passenger rail or another project, what is that? And this is the way that the CREATE program has functioned, right? What is the public versus the private benefit in that? And once you develop and understand that formula ratio, you can have a much better conversation on what that investment's going to look like and who has access to those funds and what's the appetite of a particular state, whether it's state or local funds or possibly going after federal funds together. So it's explaining what those benefits are. And it's not just about, well, this is going to help us move trains, you know, boxes faster. It's what is the local impact by making this investment. If UP or BNSF were to do an investment on their own, that might be a 5 to 10-year investment or a project. And if somebody wants to help accelerate that because of the public benefit, then that's where we say, hey, let's have a conversation about that and see what that looks like. Again, on the passenger side, it ends up being a different, and I'm looking at my friend Rob Padgett here from Capital Corridor, is he wants to grow his service. He wants to better serve his customers. How does he do that? Capital Corridor has always recognized the fastest way to do that is by making investments on the corridor, on the route. And so if he wants to get to whatever his max capacity is in growth, is that a third mainline project? Is that siding expansions? Is that a new junction or a Y junction, in the Bay Area? Those are the things that we all have to map out. But again, identifying what the public benefits are versus a pure private benefit and the willingness to make it a sustainable project that's the approach that we've been far better at. But again, to have that conversation, it takes the interest to do it. So.
Thank you. Angela, any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely agree with Adrian's comments. And, I think step one, or table stakes, if you will, is just to recognize the interdependent nature of these different transportation modes, right? Especially when you're making investment decisions. And so inputs needed from a broad group of stakeholders. That collaboration is a must to coexist. And so even though freight railroads are almost entirely privately funded, there's many important projects that should and can involve public and private funding. I mean, especially when there's an interface of roads, rails, ports, et cetera. So we need to collaborate, be solution oriented, and when it comes to these important decisions and investment decisions.
Thank you. And speaking of collaboration and opportunities for partnership, passenger rail has been brought up a few times. In thinking about network resiliency and synergy between passenger and freight operations, and this is a question for any of our panelists, can we do better than simply merely tolerating one another? Is there actually an opportunity for the sum of both to be greater than its parts? And I just saw Karen Hedlund grab the microphone. So, Karen.
Earlier this year, we entertained Amtrak and their host railroads for an 11-day hearing on their efforts to restart passenger rail service along the Gulf Coast. And at the end of it, we kind of scratched our tummies and tried to figure out, okay, what are we going to do about this? And we actually came up with a really interesting solution that I am never going to disclose, but I can tell you that the host railroads and Amtrak would both have been seriously annoyed with us. So what, in fact, they did was get together in the back room and come up with a settlement. The settlement relies on money coming from the federal government and some other places, but negotiated solutions are always better than ones that come down from on high from a bunch of people like us who aren't close enough to maybe get it absolutely right. So collaboration is essential. Now, you know, we're sort of, we act in interorum. If you don't figure it out yourselves, you're going to get, you know, you're going to get an answer from us and you may not like it.
No, I think they're, to Karen's point, working directly with our passenger partners is hands down the best solution. You know, and we have a kind of potpourri of passenger service throughout the UP system, and it's different models. Back in my hometown, which I helped operate the metro service, commuter service, UP was the biggest provider of that, and we actually ran that service on behalf of Metro. You know, things are changing on that front. However, in California, we have different models of passenger systems. I mentioned Capital Corridor. Capital Corridor has direct agreements with Union Pacific on the investments they make, yet they still have Amtrak as an operator. LoSan, right, that runs the Pacific Surfliner down in Southern California from San Diego all the way to San Luis Obispo. Similar, they have a direct service agreement which allows them to negotiate the investments they want to make to grow their service. That's completely separate of Amtrak on how they pursue that. And then you have ACE and the San Joaquins, and I remember that hearing, and I remember Stacy Mortensen talking about the tale of two railroads that her agency runs. One is ACE, that has a third-party operator in Herzog, and the other is Amtrak. And she went into detail, excruciating detail of what the different service looks like. And so Stacy, like Rob, have figured out making a direct agreement that allows them to make the investments to grow their service and better negotiate the right level of capital investment needs so that we don't end up in on-time performance issues is hands down the best way to go.
Thank you. Peter, Angela, anything else that you'd like to add?
I would like to say that the working relationship between the Class 1 railroads, particularly in the West, and local communities and local governments is so essential because we are finding sometimes the local government and the state government is very enthusiastic about building the infrastructure for a inland load point, transload facility. And sometimes not necessarily economically justified from the point of view of, say, the Class 1, and perhaps not coordinated with regard to the passenger rail usage of that track. So I think this collaboration is going to be very important. Sometimes I would say a local community can be overly enthusiastic. It may not, it's not that it doesn't work for the Class 1. It may not just not work for the actual commodity that's targeted to be moved through that facility. So I think the railroads have really sophisticated economic analysis of what the market needs and will bear and can supply and can afford. And we need to have the local governments and the politicians who just want to build something understand those economics. And I've encouraged them to look more towards the Class 1 railroads and their economic analysis than in some cases they have.
David, can I just piggyback on that?
Absolutely.
Peter said something really important there, and I think it's salient to the audience here and given where we are, right? So there's a lot of talk and interest, and it was last year, and I heard it this year, and I know it's going to be a lot more talk tomorrow about pioneer service, right? What does that look like? How do we do it? The local communities have been really good about coming through the front door and working, talking directly to Union Pacific about how do we do that. When they have a good understanding of how do you actually build passenger service, how do we select an operator, how do we fund this? Looking back at my old slide that I talked about the investments, you see the significant amount of investment that's happening between on our PNW route, right? That's going to go to Portland. We're doing that for freight growth. So when we talk to a community on a proposed passenger service, how do you look at that corridor? And our number one goal is protecting existing customers in addition to the future growth. So if we introduce passenger service to a corridor that has what we anticipate to be more freight growth, how do we coexist in the right way? And again, the investment ends up being key to that. And I think understanding, what the expectations are on building the infrastructure so that it doesn't run into a foul situation where you get the service and then 2, 3 years down the road, the honeymoon phase is over and the service is not running as it should, both passenger or freight, and you don't have the justified ridership to explain why we pursued passenger in the first place. And I think that's, those are the harder conversations, but I think, again, the modeling is going to be key to that if and when, the communities and the states are ready to have that discussion. So I think, again, it's a very productive conversation when we start entertaining and engaging and pursuing those conversations on the passenger front. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say it in front of our ag customers in the room. We got to protect that service before we start considering introducing new passenger service on a corridor, especially if it's going to be commuter.
Thank you. Angela, anything?
Sure. I mean, I would just kind of wrap up everybody's comments. I think, I'm a glasses half full person, and I'm very optimistic, even though there's challenges, there's complexities, and I have that optimism because we have a strong history of collaborating with various passenger agencies, state and local partners, as well as Amtrak. I mean, there's numerous examples. We've built out at BNSF portions of our subdivisions in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Scenic, Bellingham, and that supports Amtrak. It supports our commuter trains, and it also maintains our freight operations and enables us to grow, specifically grain for export markets. So we have some great successes that we can continue to build on, where there were complexities, there were challenges, but that collaboration did indeed work.
I am all about that glass half full. Thanks for that, Angela. So how many folks in the audience here are elected officials or associated with a Department of Transportation, either state or provincial? Okay, a ton. Holy smokes. Time for a little bit of the good, the bad, and the ugly here. So I want folks to be able to leave with something they could sink their teeth into in terms of ways in which state, even local elected officials can play a more meaningful role in freight operations, certainly passenger operations, but a good chunk of what we're talking about today is freight operations and ag operations related to freight. What can we do? Because if you look across the landscape of the United States, there's a wide variety of how involved, for instance, state DOTs are in seeing themselves as a player when it comes to rail. Aaron.
From my experience, I'm going to say at FRA and a little bit of my experience at STB, some states are very committed and have very strong rail programs, and those states' rail programs also focus on freight, not just passenger rail. And I'm thinking about Ohio, for example, that has put a lot of work into their freight rail and their short rail systems. There are other states that, barely have 1 or 2 people in the Department of Transportation that do anything on rail. There is a very large state that I will not mention, that has one very hardworking person, but they need more resources. So FRA is actually, has got a program to help strengthen state DOTs. One other thing I wanted to mention now that I've just got the mic, and this is for the local representatives. There is an issue out there that's getting a lot of press, and it's blocked crossings. Some states have gone so far as to pass legislation that would give the state authority to deal with blocked crossings. And that case is in the courts as we speak. From our perspective, we think there's a regulatory gap. the states may not have the authority to regulate block crossings because it steps on the national railroad system, and that's in the purview of the national government. But neither FRA nor the STB have any specific legislative authority to deal with block crossings, although we can deal with them in the context of particular transactions. And in the big merger that we approved earlier this year, we spent a lot of time with the local communities talking about whether the increase in traffic would make their own block crossing situations more difficult. And the railroad stepped up and said, hey, we're going to put some money in to help pay for new railroad crossings. My colleague, Robert Primus, and I went down because a local county commissioner from Harris County in Houston had come and appeared at an environmental hearing we had in Beaumont. And he said, you got to come to Harris County, to the east side of Houston, and see what we are dealing with. So we went and actually looked at what was going on there. That didn't particularly relate to the merger. Merger wasn't going to have a big impact on that, but there was a big problem there. It was clear Houston needs a CREATE program, and we promised to work with the folks in Houston to help get that started, and we're going to do the same thing in New Orleans.
Adrian.
Yeah, no, on the, how I think of block crossings, I think about, collaboration, from a local perspective, and that's what myself and my team, I have Aaron Hunt here, who covers this territory in the PNW. We, daily, weekly basis, we're talking to local mayors, city managers, DOTs, various road authorities about what their needs are, what are the priorities, whether it's coming from an issue-based standpoint or it's a prospective priority that they want to pursue. I think of Houston, I think again Chicago, and whoever made the comment earlier about the stockyards, you need grade separations, right? You don't want grade crossings out there. Grade crossings are not good. It is the #1 safety issue that the railroad industry and road authorities face. And that is the entire reason that the FRA has a program, a massive funding program to close as many crossings as possible. And I know that is not what the locals want to hear. It's a very difficult issue to pursue. And as communities continue to grow, this is one that we've been facing in Utah as well, is how can you be more thoughtful and collaborative on addressing safety issues at crossings, but then also having a serious conversation about pursuing the needed infrastructure investment, whether it's a PED overpass, underpass, right, or a vehicular grade separation. So safety is going to be at the key to that. On the collaborative front, I think about the states and state rail plans, right? And a lot of states are getting wise to, well, if we're going to go after this federal money, we need a state rail plan in place. And most of the time, in the states that I cover, the DOTs are late to come to the freight railroads and say, hey, this is what we've put together. What do you think about this? A lot of times they publish it, there's a draft form out there, and then we have to provide the reality check on actually there's challenges here, or do it better this way, or consider this. It puts the railroads in a tough spot when, and even on the freight, on the federal grant side or state grant side, a local community gets funding before they've ever approached a railroad. And then when a timing issue comes up, and a grant's about to expire, we end up being the bad guy. So coming in early, often, and being collaborative, addressing what our agenda is, our mutual agenda, is the best way.
Thanks. Angela, 30 seconds. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just agree. I mean, that awareness of the concerns and the needs are crucial, as well as involving the railroads early in those conversations, just to identify potentially unintended consequences. I mean, Karen mentioned it as well. Again, playing that vital link in the supply chain, some proposed legislation on the state level that may impact operating guidelines, train length restrictions, et cetera, could ultimately result, as Peter described, our flexibility to create service that serves different needs, different customers, different markets. And again, that shuttle example for our grain customers is unique to that market. And that's the way we have to be to compete with global competition. And a one size fits all doesn't work, and disruptive in offering some of those creative service solutions will also restrict some of that supply chain growth and volume growth on the freight rail system that's advantageous for all of our communities and all of our customers.
Thanks, Angela. And for folks who don't know, I'm looking at a monitor here and it has big red letters with a minus in front of the timers, meaning we are over time. My apologies for folks who submitted questions online. There's some great questions such as, what impact will the strike at the Port of Vancouver have on commerce in the Pacific Northwest? I won't read them all. Resubmit those at the next session. Maybe we can actually get those answered because there's some similarities between this session and the next one. We could have used another half an hour easily, probably. Great discussion. Thank you, panelists. Thank you all who have joined us. And Bruce, are you wrapping up here, or take a 15-minute break? Come back at 10:45, better together in this room. Thank you all.